Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back. So today I want to talk to you about Active Directory. I'm sure some of you are wondering what are you talking about. Now, this video is actually intended for a lot of you who are either IT pros or developers. So if you've ever interacted with any Microsoft service, you probably have used Active Directory in one form or shape, and especially if you've used one of the offline services. So if you used Windows Server, if you use Exchange Server, SharePoint Server, or actually some consumer services like Xbox, like Hotmail. So you've used Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. So the difference is Active Directory runs on premise and Azure Active Directory runs in the cloud. Now they can do sort of almost this, but they are slightly different. If you're interested in learning the difference, I'll put some links down below of that information. So you'll probably hear me refer to them as AD or Azure AD. Cool. So let's start with AD. So AD is the authentication service that Microsoft uses in a lot of its products. So this started actually quite a number of years ago, and this is what holds information around your usernames or people's email addresses and passwords, and by extension some devices. So Active Directory actually is capable of storing a lot of information. So that could be your username, your email address, your department, your location, your devices, but it's primarily built to store information around the person and the devices that they use. Now, Azure Active Directory, on the other hand, can store a lot more of information around your address, your personal email, your phone number, and a lot more. So they each have slight differences in what they are able to store, but you can actually sync them across and what you use of them. And I'll talk about where each of them is implemented and which one to choose now. Since we're going into a lot of very cloud first world, you will rarely hear people talk about Active Directory. So let's actually focus on Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is actually powerful. So if you use any Microsoft services, whether consumer or business, you've used some form or shape of Active Directory. So let's actually take an example. So if you have a Hotmail, Outlook, or live.com email address, that actually today sits on some level of an Azure Active Directory. And that stores information about your user account, and that's what pervades across the different services. So whether it's your email account, your Skype, your Xbox, that actually uses some level or form of Azure Active Directory or Azure AD. If you use things like Office 365, Dynamics, and actually quite recently heavily integrated Windows, you've also used Active Directory. Now, Active Directory is designed around businesses. So it's a service that you use to store your email accounts and actually accounts for your employees. So Active Directory is based on a couple of things. So let's look at how it's structured. So at the bottom of it, every company that signs up for a Microsoft service gets what's called a tenant. So for every company, you have a tenant. In some companies, they actually have multi-tenant environments, but best practice is for one organization, you can have one tenant. And this one tenant is identified with a tenant ID. So let's give an example. If I was to go sign up for a Microsoft service, I could choose to call it Somet. So my tenant name would be somet.onmicrosoft.com, and I'm sure some of you signing up on Teams quite recently have seen that, and you're probably wondering, why is this long email accounts coming from? That's actually their tenant name, and that's how Microsoft is able to identify different companies. Now, on this tenant, you can actually tie in your domain, so that is unique to you, so you don't have to use the default ID. So you can tie in your domain and then tie this tenant to every Microsoft service. So if your organization uses Office, Dynamics, or any other Microsoft service, you can actually tie them all back to one identity. So the idea is one set of credentials across. You can actually also use this tenant and tie in a lot of third-party services. So you can use this tenant and the same set of credentials and accounts that you create across multiple applications, and we'll talk about that. It's called single sign-on. Now, Azure AD is interesting, the fact that it actually runs on the cloud and you can tie it to a number of different first-party or third-party services, right? So let's look at what you can do with a tenant. So once you have an Azure AD tenant, what you can have on top, and let's focus on Azure, the cloud service, you can have multiple subscriptions and multiple services. So let's say I have one big tenant called this Kenyan dev, or let's say I have this huge tenant called sometkip.com, which is actually my website, so interesting. So I have a tenant called sometkip.com, and I can tie in a number of services back to that. So if I have an Office 365 subscription, I can add it on there. If I have an Azure subscription for my dev, I can add it on there. If I have another subscription for production, I can add it on there. So I can layer a number of different subscriptions. I can decide to give a subscription to every one of my employees and have that sit all on one tenant. Now, the reason you want to unify everything under one tenant, it gives you a bit more control into doing a lot more interesting things, which I'll talk about when I get excited about this stuff. So you have subscriptions, and then on this subscription you also have user accounts. Now, one of the cool things Azure AD stores is, one, not only the profile of the user but also the devices that they have. So I can actually go into AD and understand, hey, this is all the devices this person has, this is who they are, and so you are able to create one set of identities across your entire organization. You can take this one identity and actually push the boundary of what you can do. So I've seen some really interesting scenarios in my day. So you can take Azure Active Directory, tie it to, let's say, your door access system. You can tie it to your Wi-Fi system, and that way you're able to control and centralize identity back into one place. So and especially for business scenario, if you, let's say, want to be able to know, hey, what does Somet actually do across, what permissions do they have, you can set permissions at once, and you then have a very good view of what permissions I have and what devices I have and who am I. Now, beyond just accounts, you can create things like groups. So you can use these groups either to assign access to applications, access to certain permissions. And in fact, a rule of thumb when you're assigning permissions is, instead of assigning individual permissions to individual people, you can create what's called a security group and add permissions to this group and then add people as members. That actually is interesting, especially if your company grows and you have multiple users. You don't want to try and figure out, okay, what permission did this person have or what do they not have. Let's say if they transition from one role to another. So it creates some very interesting scenarios of what you can do with Active Directory. Beyond that, you can do quite a number of things. You can track sign-ins, you can track devices, you can assign policies, and so it starts giving you better control over what kinds of services or applications or devices that your employees use. So Active Directory is actually quite powerful. That's just the basics of Azure Active Directory. If you want me to deep dive on, please write it down in the comments and let me know what part of Azure AD you want me to deep dive on. Now, if you have servers on premise that already run some form of AD and you want to sync that to the cloud, you can do a sync back and forth using a tool called AD Connect, and I'll talk more about that. So you have limitless possibilities for what you can do. Thank you so much again for spending time with me today. If you like this, please like, share, subscribe, and put down in the comments what more you want me to cover. Thank you. See you again on the next one.